Well, hi there. This is September 27th homework, just a review of what we covered in class. Primarily, what we're working on is two things. One of them is the PEMDAS, PEMDAS, um, and the main focus that we had on it was in one of the worksheets, one of the four handouts. That was that addition and subtraction doesn't really matter if you can do all the positives and all the negatives, adding them together doesn't matter so much. But the multiplication and division, you have to go left to right. Most people just go left to right no matter what. But as an example, if I were to say 5 times 10 divided by 2, I would say, okay, well, what's 5 times 10? That's 50. 50 divided by 2 is 25. Okay, that generally works out okay. And I just went in a row. What if I said 10 divided by 2? 10 divided by 2 is 5. 5 times 5 is 25. Generally works out pretty well um, if multiplication is first. But you can't really reverse that. So if I were to say, okay, let's try 100 um, divided by 10 times 3. In this case, I would do this left to right. I would say, what's 100 divided by 10? Well, that's 10. And then what's 10 times 3? Well, that's 30. That's if I go left to right. What if I do the multiplication first? What's 10 times 3? Well, that's 30. What's 100 divided by 30? 100 divided by 30 is 3.33. Notice that this one and this one are not the same. The correct answer is this one. We have to do them left to right. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Generally speaking, multiplication first, then division, it works just fine. But when you've got a division and multiplication kind of backwards, you can't do it. You have to go left to right. Addition and subtraction is a little bit different. So if I were to say 5 plus 3 minus 6, I would say, okay, what's 5 plus 3? That's 8. 8 minus 6 is 2. Or if I were to say, what's 3 minus 6? Well, that's negative 3. What's 5 plus negative 3? Well, that's 2. It doesn't matter what order you do these when it's addition and subtraction. You can do the minus signs, the plus signs. Just as a rule of thumb, just go left to right and you will not run into problems. Okay, so that's the first piece of what it is we're trying to cover. And then you had a bunch of problems on one of the four handouts that give you practice at that. Okay, the second part of what we're dealing with today is how to deal with positive and negative numbers. Now, as you know, you have to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So we're going to deal with positive and negative numbers. There are many ways to think of this. Eventually, it'll just become normal. Uh, um, First of all, this concept of negative numbers, the first concept is most people think of negative numbers as a number line. They are the numbers that are to the left. So that would be -1, -2, -3. And we would write them that way. And then on this side, you would have +1, 2, and 3. So the positives on the right, negatives are on the left. Most people think of it that way. An alternative way to think of negative numbers is that negative means opposite. Again, concept of number line, that's pretty simple. If I were to say, what's the opposite of 3? You would say, well, it's on the other side. Think of it as like a mirror image of this, and it would be -3. That means the opposite. So if I were to say, what's the opposite of 4? -4. So just the number, or sorry, the symbol, this little minus sign symbol, means opposite. So if I were to write an equation, say for example 5 plus the opposite of 4, in your head what that means is that I've got on a number line 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over here. Okay, plus the opposite of 4. Well, 5 is that way. 4 is that way. What's the opposite of 4? Well, it's that way. So a 5 going 5 to the right, and a 4, the opposite of what a regular 4 would be, would end us up there at 1. Okay, that's another way to look at it. Negative just means opposite. So what's the opposite of 3? Well, what's the opposite of 3? That's an arrow going to the left. What's the opposite of an arrow going to the left? It's to the right. So the answer would be 3. So this is where we get the idea of the negative of a negative is a positive. Two negatives, two wrongs don't make a right. Well, in this case, two negatives make a right. If right by that means is to the right. So negative means opposite of, and that's really what's going on here. So if I were to say, what's the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of 4? Okay, I have to kind of start with this. The opposite of 4 is an arrow that way. The opposite of that is an arrow that way. The opposite of that is an arrow that way. The opposite of that is an arrow that way. So whatever I end up with is going to be to the right, or a positive 4. Now you can summarize this a little bit when you have these things. You'll note that if I have the opposite of 5, there's one of those. That means it's to the left. If I have the opposite of 5, it's to the right. If I have the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of 5, it's going to the left, then to the right, then to the left again, and it's going to be to the left. Now you notice this is 1 goes to the left, 3 goes to the left, 4 goes to the right again. So the opposite of 5 is the left, and the opposite of that is to the right, then the opposite of that is to the left, and the opposite of that is to the right. There. So we can kind of, once we see the pattern, we can say, look, there's 1 negative, there's 2 negatives, there's 3 negatives, there's 4 negatives. These are odd numbers. Odd numbers of negatives are always negative. So if I had 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is that opposite? Is that going to be what? Positive or negative? Well, it'll be negative because it's an odd number. If I had 4, that's going to be a positive number. Any even number is going to give you positive. Any odd number is going to give you negative. So that's another summary point that you eventually get, but that's why it is. If you think of what it means opposite, just think of it as arrows. Now, most people don't remember arrows and they go, the opposite of this is the opposite of that. And then they go, there's an arrow here and then here, and then they're going to. No, what they do in their head is they remember, oh, it's a 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, or it's a 2, 4, 6, 8. Positive or negative numbers is really what rules the day. Okay, next thing that we want to look at is multiplication, addition, subtraction, and division. Okay, when we're dealing with positive and negative numbers. Division, I'm going to hold off on, and we're going to really not do much with that. We're just going to get to that in a little bit. So let's start with the easy ones. You basically have 4 kinds of things. It's where you have a positive number plus a positive number equals a positive number. In your head, you should be thinking that's a positive 4 plus a positive 5 equals a positive 9. Now that looks silly to put all those little plus signs in there, so we don't. Because you see a 4, that's a positive 4. How do I know it's a positive 4? Because it has a 4 in there. There's nothing that says it's not. So you assume it's positive unless it tells you it's not. A plus sign, that's a positive 5. So I have 4 plus a positive 5, and I end up with a positive 9. Again, we learned back in second grade 4 plus 5 equals 9, and we don't use these terms positive and negative. But what we do learn is we learn in first and second grade, we learned that 6 minus 2 equals 4. And we use the concept of takeaway, or we say if you have 6 and you take away 2, then that's 4. And that's true. And there's nothing wrong with learning that. It is to learn algebra, we have to think a little differently, or you'll get confused because we're no longer using numbers all the time in algebra. We're using symbols. And so, what your brain should be saying is this is the same as 6 plus a negative 2. In other words, you have 6 going to the right and 2 off to the left. And what did you end up with? You ended up with 4 to the right. So you have positive 6 plus a negative 2 is a 4. Now, these little symbols where you have plus and minus, and I put them up high there, that's mostly common in handwriting. When you're trying to write a textbook, it's really, really hard to do. So even when they're trying to introduce this concept, what they'll do is they'll say 6 plus, and they'll put in parentheses, negative 2 equals. And so this is the same thing. A 6 plus a negative 2 equals, if you put the negative up high, you don't have to put the stupid parentheses in there. Makes it a little bit easier to read. Makes it a little more confusing because it says, look, am I plussing or am I minusing? Well, that's where you have to be careful in your penmanship, and that is put the numbers, put the little symbols up high. Don't say 6 plus minus 2. That just is confusing. 6 plus a negative 2 is not so confusing. Got it? So keep it high and there, and you're not going to have any. This again means 6 plus negative 2. So parentheses is the same as putting that thing up high. So that's the next thing. And the rule of thumb when you're subtracting or you're adding negative numbers is you have a positive number, you have a negative number. So what's the answer? The answer is always going to be the big number minus the small number. So let's say I have 10 minus 15. Okay. That's the same as, again, it's a positive 10 plus a negative 15. Well, the answer is going to be the big number, that's 15, minus the small number, that's 10. What's 15 minus 10? It's 5. Okay. So the answer is 5. And then the answer is going to be something, but the symbol, this little symbol here, is whatever the big number is. So in this case, the big number was 15, so the answer is going to be negative. That's how I know. 15 is bigger than 10, so I just take the big minus the small, but the answer is there. If I were to say 15 minus 10, you would know that answer, and that's 5. Well, again, let's use the rule. The big number minus the small number is 5. What's the symbol in front of the big number? It's a positive, so it's a positive 5. So you already know how to do that without even knowing that you know how to do that. So big number minus small number, and that gives you there. So even when you have a really big string of numbers, let's try this. 8 plus 3 minus 6 minus 2 plus 9 minus 3. And I want to know what that is equal to. Well, I'm going to think of it this way. I have a positive 8, and I have a positive 3, and I have a negative 6, and I have a negative 2, and I have a positive 9, and I have a negative 3. Oops, negative 3. I'm going to circle the positive ones. I have an 8, a 3, a 9. What's 8 and 3 and 9? Well, 8 plus 3 is 11. 11 plus 9 is 20. So I have a positive 20. What's 6 plus 2 plus 3? Add all the negatives together. In other words, all my left arrows. So 6 and 2 is 8. 8 and 3 is 11. So I have 11 negative numbers. Okay, so I will end up, even if you have a long string of numbers, in a very, very short step, you can say, what are all the positive numbers? That's those. What are all the negative numbers? That's those. Um, And then we go back to our rule. Big minus small. Oh, I've got 20 minus 11 is 9. And what's the symbol? 20 is the bigger number. So the answer of this is 9. Okay. Now, you may think of that as being funky, but I'm going to give you a little bit of preview algebra wise. So let's say you had 3a plus 4b minus 2a plus 6b minus b plus a. And you're saying, algebra, no, you said, use the same concept. In your head, I have a's and b's. So what I would be doing in this problem is I would take all the A's, put them together, then I'd take all the B's and put them together. In the same way here, I took all the positive numbers, put them together, and put all the negative numbers, put them together. So what I'm training you to do here is not to learn something new just because you don't know how to add and subtract. What I'm trying to do is get your brain to start thinking of identifying things as this is that type. This is a positive 8, a positive 3, a positive 9. Group those together. A negative 6, a negative 2, a negative 3. Group those together. So when you get to algebra, you'll be doing the same thing. Doesn't really change the math of it, but it changes how your brain thinks about the math of it. Okay, now we're going to do multiplication of negative numbers. So let's say I have 3 times 5. Again, how can you write 3 times 5? You can write 3x5. Why is that bad? Well, because in algebra we use x all the time. So this looks like 3 times 5 times x. It looks like 15x. Yeah, we don't write it that way. We go 3.5 or 3.5. It's really easy to mistake that for a decimal place. So we generally do not use dots unless we mean decimal place. Because I don't know about you, but it's easy to be sloppy when you're handwriting. And if I wrote, is that 3 times 5 or 3.5? Honestly, it's 3.5 because I only use dots to mean multiply. Or I'm sorry, I only use dots to mean, right, decimal points. So when you have two numbers next to each other, I can't just write 3.5 because that looks like 35. So in algebra, if we put two numbers next to each other, we generally put parentheses. That means 3 times 5. So back to this. 3 times 5 is 15. You knew that. That's fine. Okay. What's a negative 3 times 5? Well, do the math first. 3 times 5, 15. And just put the negative sign in front of it. Because remember, negative means opposite. Well, what's 3 times 5? It's 15. What's the opposite of 3.3 times 5? It's negative 15. So if you keep in your head the idea of opposite is what that means, it makes it easier to understand. You don't have to like remember a rule. So if I were to say negative 4 times negative 5, okay, well, what's 4 times 5? It's 20. Okay, what's the opposite of the opposite? In other words, what's the rule when you have two negatives? The opposite of an opposite is regular, so it's positive 20. So when you're multiplying, it's kind of like, again, these negative signs just are, if you think opposite, if you have an even number, it's just positive. If you have an odd number, it's negative when you're multiplying. It's different when you're doing some other stuff, but when you're multiplying, it's just opposite of the opposite, which is positive. Um, okay, so that is primarily what you've got for homework. Now we're going to move on to what about next week on our next video.